The rain didn't fall on the backstreets of the city. It descended like judgment, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected nothing but broken neon signs and the ghosts of forgotten promises. Zuri Bennett was 10 years old the night she learned that mercy could be a weapon sharper than any blade. She walked alone through the downpour, her yellow raincoat a splash of defiant sunshine against the bruised sky, clutching her red umbrella like a shield against the world's cruelty. That's when she saw him. Park Joon-Seok, the name that made grown men cross themselves and politicians check their locks twice, lay crumpled in a pool of rain and blood on a desolate street where even the streetlights had learned to look away. His dark suit was torn, revealing glimpses of ink, dragons and demons that seemed to writhe across his skin even in stillness. His face, sharp and beautiful in a way that promised violence, was turned toward the storm as if waiting for the sky itself to finish what his enemies had started. Any sane person would have kept walking. Any child should have run. Zuri knelt in the mud. She positioned her red umbrella over the unconscious man. Her small hands trembling not from fear but from the weight of a choice she was too young to understand and too pure to refuse. Rain hammered against the fabric above them while she stayed. A girl in a bright yellow raincoat shielding a monster from the storm, unaware that this single act of kindness would rewrite the ledger of both their lives. In that moment, beneath thunder that sounded like war drums, she became his redemption, and he became her future. Would you shield a devil from the rain if you knew he was the only one who could eventually save you from the fire? Before we dive deeper into this story, I need to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And if you're new to Mafia Moonlight Tales, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories we tell here don't follow the rules. Like this video if you're ready to see how one umbrella changed the fate of an entire city, and share it with someone who believes that sometimes the smallest acts of mercy forge the strongest alliances. Now let's continue. The storm that night was the kind that washed away evidence and erased witnesses. Zuri didn't know that the man bleeding beneath her umbrella was Park Joon-Seok, the youngest head of the most feared Korean crime family in the city. She didn't know that the tattoos snaking up his arms were a map of every enemy he'd buried, every debt he'd collected, every promise he'd kept written in permanent ink. She only knew that he was hurt, and that leaving him there felt like abandoning a piece of her own soul. His eyes flickered open once, just for a heartbeat, and in that fragment of consciousness he saw her. Not the city that had tried to kill him. Not the rivals who had left him for dead like garbage in an alley. He saw a child with eyes too old for her face and a heart too big for this cruel world, holding an umbrella over a stranger in the rain because it was the right thing to do. Park Joon-Seok was a man built from scars and silence, raised in a cathedral of glass and cold ambition where mercy was weakness and kindness was currency you couldn't afford to spend. He had ink on his skin and ice in his veins. He had learned to survive by becoming the most dangerous piece on the board. But he had never learned what it felt like to be saved. "Stay still," Zuri whispered, her voice barely audible over the thunder. She didn't know if he could hear her. She didn't know if he would survive the night. She only knew that she couldn't leave him. Not like this. Not alone. Help came eventually. Dark cars with tinted windows and men who moved like shadows, their faces carved from the same stone as their loyalty. They found her still kneeling there, her umbrella a defiant splash of red against the black storm. Her yellow raincoat soaked through but her grip unwavering. One of the men tried to move her away, but Joon-Seok's hand, weak, trembling but unmistakable, reached out and stopped him. His fingers brushed against hers for just a second. A silent promise in a language neither of them yet understood. "I will remember you." And then he was gone, carried away into the night by his sentinels, leaving Zuri alone in the rain with nothing but the echo of thunder and the strange certainty that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. She didn't know that from that night forward, Park Joon-Seok's eyes would always be on her, a vigilant sentinel watching from the shadows as she grew from a girl in a yellow raincoat into a young woman navigating a world that saw kindness as weakness and compassion as a ledger written in red ink. She didn't know that 7 years later, when her family's world collapsed under the weight of debt and betrayal, when predatory creditors circled her home like vultures and her future looked like nothing but darkness, the monster she saved in the rain would return. Not as a debtor, as a king. And he would claim the only person who had ever seen him as human, the girl who proved that survivors don't just endure, they rule. The alley smelled like rust and rain and something darker that Zuri's 10-year-old mind couldn't name but her instincts recognized as danger. She should have been home an hour ago. Her grandmother would be worried, pacing the small kitchen of their apartment, watching the clock tick past dinner time. But the storm had turned the familiar streets into a maze of flooding gutters and impassable shortcuts, and Zuri had taken the long way around, through neighborhoods where even the streetlights flickered like dying heartbeats. That's when she saw the shape. At first, she thought it was a pile of discarded clothes, dark fabric bunched against the curb where the rain had pooled into something that looked too much like blood. But then she saw his hand, pale against the black asphalt, fingers slightly curled as if reaching for something that had already abandoned him. Zuri's heart hammered against her ribs. Every lesson her grandmother had drilled into her screamed to keep walking. Don't stop for strangers. Don't get involved. In this city, curiosity was a luxury that got good people killed. But he wasn't moving. She took 3 steps closer, her yellow raincoat squeaking with each movement, and that's when she saw his face. Even unconscious, even broken and bleeding, there was something about him that didn't belong in this forgotten corner of the city. His features were sharp and elegant, carved with a precision that suggested wealth, power, danger. A tattoo of a serpent coiled up the side of his neck, disappearing beneath the collar of his expensive suit. This was not a man who ended up in alleys by accident. Blood seeped from a wound on his side, mixing with the rainwater in ribbons of crimson that spiraled down the gutter like silk scarves. His breathing was shallow, labored. Dying, Zuri realized with a clarity that felt too old for her small body. This man was dying, and the storm was washing away any chance of someone finding him in time. She looked around. The street was empty. No cars. No witnesses. Just the rain and the thunder and this stranger whose life was leaking out onto the pavement while the world looked away. Zuri made a choice. She knelt beside him, her knees sinking into the cold, muddy water, and opened her red umbrella. It was a cheap thing, bought from a street vendor, the fabric already starting to tear at the seams. But it was all she had. She positioned it carefully over his face and chest, shielding him from the worst of the downpour. "I'm here," she whispered, not sure if he could hear her, not sure if it even mattered. "You're not alone." The rain beat against the umbrella like fists demanding entry. Thunder cracked across the sky, and lightning illuminated the scene in stark, clinical detail. A child in a bright yellow raincoat holding vigil over a dying man in a designer suit, both of them soaked to the bone, both of them impossibly out of place. Zuri didn't know how long she stayed there. Minutes. Hours. Time moved differently in the storm. Her arms ached from holding the umbrella steady. Her teeth chattered from the cold. But she didn't let go. And then headlights cut through the rain. The men who emerged from the black cars moved with the precision of soldiers, their faces carved from stone and silence. They surrounded the scene, Zuri kneeling in the rain, her red umbrella still faithfully positioned over the unconscious man, her yellow raincoat a beacon in the darkness. One of them, older with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, approached her with something that might have been respect softening the hard lines of his face. "You should go home, little one," he said in accented English. His voice surprisingly gentle. "This is not a place for children." Zuri looked up at him, rain streaming down her face, her grip on the umbrella unwavering. "Is he going to be okay?" The man glanced at his fallen boss, then back at the girl who had chosen mercy over self-preservation. "Because of you," he said quietly. "He has a chance." They lifted Joon-Seok with practiced efficiency, carrying him to the waiting car. As they moved him, his eyes flickered open one last time. Through the haze of pain and blood loss, he found her, the girl in the yellow raincoat who had knelt in the mud for a stranger. Their eyes met for 3 seconds that felt like a binding contract written in rain and gratitude. Then he was gone, swallowed by tinted windows and the roar of engines, leaving Zuri alone in the storm with her red umbrella and the strange weight of knowing she had just altered the trajectory of something far bigger than herself. She never saw him again. But that didn't mean he wasn't there. 7 years passed like chapters in a book Zuri didn't know she was writing. She grew from a girl in a yellow raincoat into a young woman with her grandmother's quiet strength and her own fierce compassion. She studied hard, worked part-time at a bookstore, walked the same streets where she'd once found a dying man, unaware that every step she took was monitored by eyes that had never forgotten. Park Joon-Seok kept his distance like a vigilant sentinel guarding a shrine. He recovered in private hospitals where questions weren't asked, rebuilt his empire from the ashes of betrayal, eliminated the rivals who had left him for dead with surgical precision. But through it all, through every meeting and every victory, a portion of his attention remained fixed on the girl who had saved him. He knew where she lived, a modest apartment she shared with her grandmother in a neighborhood that teetered between working-class dignity and slow decay. He knew her routine, school, then the bookstore, then home before dark because her grandmother worried. He knew her dreams, college, a degree in social work, a desperate desire to help people the way she'd helped a stranger in the rain. His men became her invisible protection. The group of drunk men who started following her home one night. They woke up in the hospital with no memory of how they got there. The bookstore that kept cutting her hours suddenly received an anonymous investment that required they keep their best employee. The scholarship application that had been buried under bureaucracy mysteriously pushed to the top of the pile. Zuri attributed it all to luck, to providence, to the universe finally being kind. She had no idea that a king made of ink and ice watched over her from the shadows, waiting for the day when he could finally repay the debt that had been accruing interest in the currency of devotion for 7 long years. That day was coming. Because mercy, once given, never truly disappears. It simply waits for the perfect moment to return. The call came on a Tuesday, which felt cruelly ordinary for the day Zuri's world began to crumble. Her grandmother had collapsed at the grocery store, a massive stroke that left her clinging to life in an ICU bed, surrounded by machines that beeped out the rhythm of borrowed time. Zuri held her hand and watched the woman who had raised her, who had been mother, father, and sanctuary all wrapped in one fierce, loving soul, slip away degree by degree. She passed on a Friday, quietly, as if apologizing for the inconvenience. The funeral was small. Zuri stood alone at the graveside, her black dress borrowed from a coworker, watching the only person who had ever truly protected her disappear into the earth. She didn't cry. The tears felt locked behind a door she couldn't quite open, trapped with all the words she'd never said and all the gratitude she'd never adequately expressed. The lawyers came the following Monday with briefcases full of paperwork and expressions that promised nothing good. "Your grandmother took out a second mortgage 3 years ago," the lead attorney explained. His voice clinically detached as he slid documents across the coffee table of the apartment that suddenly didn't feel like home anymore. "Medical bills from your grandfather's cancer treatment. She'd been managing the payments, but now she was gone, and the debt remained like a hungry ghost demanding to be fed." Zuri stared at the numbers that didn't make sense, zeros that multiplied into impossibility. $60,000. The apartment she'd grown up in, the only stable ground she'd ever known, was collateral for a loan that had been quietly strangling her grandmother for years while she smiled and pretended everything was fine. "You have 90 days, the attorney said, gathering his papers with the efficiency of a man who delivered bad news for a living. "After that, the property reverts to the lender." The lenders arrived before the 90 days were up, as predators always do when they smell blood in the water. They were men in expensive suits with smiles that didn't reach their eyes, flanked by assistants who appraised the apartment's meager possessions like vultures measuring a carcass. They offered extensions with interest rates that would have made loan sharks blush, payment plans that required Zuri to sign away the next decade of her life. "You're young," one of them said, his gaze sliding over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Pretty girl like you could find alternative arrangements to settle this debt." Zuri showed them the door with her grandmother's old baseball bat in her trembling hands. But they kept coming back. Phone calls that started polite and ended with threats. Letters that detailed exactly what would happen when the foreclosure became final. Men who sat in cars across the street, watching, waiting, making sure she understood that time was not on her side. Zuri worked double shifts at the bookstore, picked up weekend cleaning jobs, sold everything that wasn't nailed down. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The debt was a mountain, and she was trying to move it with a spoon. She was 22 years old, alone in a world that saw her vulnerability as opportunity, her kindness as weakness. The girl who had once knelt in the rain to save a stranger now knelt in her grandmother's empty apartment, surrounded by eviction notices and final warnings, with nowhere left to turn. She didn't know that in a penthouse across the city, a man made of ink and ice had just received word that his debt was finally coming due. The eviction notice was taped to her door when Zuri came home from her shift, the white paper stark against the faded paint like a death certificate. 48 hours. That's all she had left before the locks would be changed, and her grandmother's memory would be boxed up and discarded like trash on the curb. Zuri stood in the hallway, staring at the notice until the words blurred together, and felt something inside her finally crack. Not break. Breaking implied there were pieces left to salvage. This was different. This was the moment when she understood that kindness and hard work and doing the right thing meant nothing in a world built on ledgers that only counted in red ink. She unlocked the door and stepped into the apartment that smelled like her grandmother's lavender soap and loss. That's when she realized she wasn't alone. He stood by the window with his back to her, a silhouette cut from shadows and expensive tailoring. The late afternoon light carved him into something both beautiful and dangerous. Broad shoulders beneath a black suit that probably cost more than her yearly salary. Dark hair swept back to reveal the serpent tattoo that coiled up his neck like a promise of violence. Zuri's hand found the baseball bat she'd left by the door. "I would advise against that," he said without turning. His voice smooth and accented, each word precisely placed like pieces on a chessboard. "I didn't break in. Your landlord was persuaded to grant me access." "Get out," Zuri said, her voice steadier than her hands. "I don't have anything worth stealing." He turned then, and the world tilted sideways. She knew that face. Not from yesterday or last week, but from 7 years ago in the rain, pale and unconscious beneath her red umbrella. The sharp features had been honed by time and survival, the boyish edges replaced with something harder. But the eyes, those dark, calculating eyes that had flickered open for just a heartbeat in that alley, were unmistakable. "You," she whispered. Park Joon-Seok smiled, and it was the kind of expression that made empires nervous. "Hello, Zuri Bennett. We meet again, though I suppose this introduction is long overdue." He moved toward her with the controlled grace of a predator who had never learned to fear prey, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "Your debt. $60,000, plus the accumulated interest and penalties. I've settled it. The apartment is yours, free and clear. Your grandmother's memory is safe." Zuri's grip on the bat loosened. "Why would you?" "Because 7 years ago, a girl in a yellow raincoat knelt in the mud to save a stranger's life when the entire city had decided I was better off dead." He set the envelope on the table between them, paid in full stamped across the front in red ink that looked disturbingly like blood. "I am a man who understands debts, Miss Bennett. And I have been waiting a very long time to settle mine." "I don't understand," Zuri said, though part of her was beginning to, and the understanding tasted like fear and something darker she couldn't name. "It's simple." Joon-Seok's eyes held hers with an intensity that felt like gravity. "I've purchased your debt, eliminated your enemies, secured your home. In exchange, you belong to me now. I'm not property." "No," he agreed softly. "You're something far more valuable. You're the girl who proved that mercy is not weakness. And in my world, that makes you the rarest asset of all." He extended his hand, an invitation and a claim wrapped in elegant fingers. "Come with me, Zuri. Let me show you what becomes of survivors who refuse to be victims." The penthouse existed in a different stratosphere than any world Zuri had ever inhabited. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a conquered territory, lights glittering below like the eyes of subjects who didn't know they were being watched. The floors were polished black marble that reflected everything and revealed nothing. The furniture was minimal and expensive, each piece chosen not for comfort but for the statement it made about power and control. This was not a home. This was a cathedral of glass and cold ambition, and Zuri stood in the center of it feeling like a bright yellow raincoat in a gallery of shadows. "Your room is on the east wing," Joon-Seok said, his tone suggesting this was a courtesy, not a negotiation. A woman appeared as if summoned, older, elegant, with eyes that assessed Zuri with the clinical efficiency of someone who had seen many things enter this fortress and few leave unchanged. "Mrs. Choi will help you settle in." Zuri followed the woman through corridors that felt more like museum halls than living spaces. Her assigned room was larger than her entire apartment had been, decorated in whites and silvers that made her feel like she was standing inside a cloud. A wardrobe had been prepared, clothes in her exact size, styles that whispered wealth in fabrics she'd only seen in store windows she couldn't afford to enter. "Mr. Park expects you for dinner at 8, Mrs. Choi said, her expression unreadable. "Dress appropriately." The door closed with a soft click that sounded disturbingly like a lock. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have seated 20 but held only 2. Joon-Seok sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding even in stillness, while Zuri occupied the seat to his right like a chess piece that hadn't yet learned its purpose on the board. "You're wondering what I expect from you," he said, cutting into his food with surgical precision. "Among other things," Zuri replied, her appetite disappearing beneath the weight of uncertainty. "I expect you to learn, to observe, to understand that the world operates on rules that your grandmother's kindness could never teach you." He set down his knife, his gaze settling on her with an intensity that felt like being seen through a microscope. "You saved my life when mercy should have been impossible. That act marked you, Miss Bennett. In my world, debts are currency, and you hold a claim that cannot be repaid with mere money. So I'm what? A trophy. Proof that even monsters can be saved." Something flickered across his face, not anger but something colder. "You're a reminder," he said quietly, "that even in a city of predators, humanity still exists. And that makes you dangerous." Over the following days, Zuri learned the architecture of his empire. Men came and went through the penthouse like shadows with purpose. Advisors, enforcers, business associates whose legitimate ventures barely concealed the blood money beneath. They all deferred to Joon-Seok with a fear that looked like respect, and they looked at Zuri with confusion that she was there at all. She watched him work from the periphery, saw how he commanded rooms without raising his voice, how his silences carried more weight than other men's threats. He was brilliant and brutal in equal measure, a king who had built his throne from the bones of those who had underestimated him. But it was in the quiet moments, late at night when he thought no one was watching, that Zuri glimpsed the truth. She saw how he stood alone at those floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the city with an expression that wasn't triumph but exhaustion. She noticed how he never let anyone stand behind him, how his hand instinctively moved to his side where a scar marked the betrayal that had almost killed him. His walls weren't built from spite. They were built from survival. And somehow, impossibly, Zuri had become the only person he'd allowed to see them at all. The invitation came on the 8th night, delivered not by Mrs. Choi but by Joon-Seok himself, appearing at her door near midnight with 2 glasses of whiskey that caught the lamplight like liquid amber. "Walk with me," he said, and it wasn't a request. He led her to a private study she hadn't known existed, hidden behind a bookshelf that swung open like something from a spy film. The room beyond was smaller, more personal, walls lined with documents and photographs connected by red string like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. At the center of it all was a single image. Zuri at 10 years old, kneeling in the rain with her red umbrella. "You've been watching me," she said, the words somewhere between accusation and understanding. "Protecting you," Joon-Seok corrected, handing her a glass. "There's a difference." He moved to the wall, his fingers tracing the connections between photographs. The men who left me to die that night. They didn't act alone. They were puppets dancing on strings pulled by someone higher up the chain. Someone who wanted my family's territory, my connections, my empire. And you've been hunting them. For 7 years. His smile was sharp enough to draw blood. I eliminated the foot soldiers first. Then the lieutenants. Then the captains. Each one fell like dominoes, and with each death, I moved closer to the architect of my near assassination. He tapped a photograph of a man in his 60s, distinguished and smiling at a charity gala. Choi Min-jun. Respected businessman, philanthropist, city councilman, and the head of the oldest crime syndicate in the city. Zuri studied the photograph, seeing nothing but a grandfather figure with kind eyes. He looks harmless, benevolent, legitimate. Joon-Seok's voice carried the weight of intimate knowledge. That's his genius. He spent 30 years building a reputation as a pillar of the community, while his empire operates in shadows so deep even the police can't find the bodies. He's untouchable because everyone loves him. So what does this have to do with me? Joon-Seok turned to face her fully, and for the first time since she'd entered his cathedral of glass, she saw something raw beneath the ice. Min-jun's power is built on an image of respectability. He attends galas. He funds orphanages. He shakes hands with politicians and poses for cameras. His whole empire rests on the illusion that he's better than men like me, that he's civilized where we are savage. Understanding bloomed cold in Zuri's chest. And I'm proof that you're not just a monster. You're proof that mercy exists even in our world. He moved closer, his presence both magnetic and terrifying. When I bring you to the table, a girl I've protected, educated, elevated, it destroys his narrative. It shows that the brutal mafia boss has honor, loyalty, humanity. Things Min-jun pretends to have but has never truly possessed. You want to use me to make him look like the real villain. I want to give him exactly what he gave me 7 years ago, Joon-Seok said softly. A reckoning he won't see coming. His hand moved to his side, to the scar hidden beneath expensive fabric. But I won't lie to you, Zuri. This makes you a target. The moment you step into the light beside me, you become a threat to the most dangerous man in the city. Zuri thought of her grandmother, of the apartment that had been saved, of 7 years of invisible protection she'd never known she'd needed. She thought of the girl in the yellow raincoat who had knelt in the rain because walking away felt like dying inside. When do we start? She asked. Joon-Seok's smile was devastating. Tomorrow we teach you how to be a queen. The transformation began at dawn with a woman named Yuna, who arrived with the quiet authority of someone who had turned rough edges into weapons for decades. She was a former intelligence operative, Joon-Seok explained, someone who understood that in rooms full of predators, the most dangerous players were often the ones who looked harmless. Power, Yuna said, circling Zuri like a sculptor assessing marble, is 90% perception. You will learn to wear it like silk, beautiful, deceptive, and sharp enough to cut when pulled tight. The lessons came in layers. First, the physical transformation. Stylists descended with fabrics that cost more than Zuri's former rent, tailoring dresses that whispered elegance and spoke authority. Her hair was shaped, her makeup refined not to hide but to highlight, a strategic presentation of strength wrapped in feminine grace. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Good, Joon-Seok said, appearing behind her reflection. Now they'll underestimate you for different reasons. The real education began in the study, where Yuna taught her the language of the underworld. She learned to read tells, the micro-expressions that revealed fear, the postures that signaled dominance, the silences that meant someone was calculating whether you were worth the risk of betraying. She studied dossiers of key players, memorizing names and connections and grudges that went back generations. In this world, Yuna explained, setting down photographs of Min-jun's inner circle, everyone has leverage and everyone has a price. Your job is to identify which matters more. Joon-Seok's lessons were different, delivered late at night over drinks that Zuri barely touched while he shared the brutal arithmetic of his empire. He taught her how loyalty was purchased and maintained, how fear and respect were currencies that required careful exchange rates, how reputation could be both shield and sword depending on who wielded it. Min-Jun builds power through legitimacy, he said, his finger tracing connections on the conspiracy wall. We'll dismantle it by exposing the rot beneath. But to do that, you need to move through his world as if you belong there. You need to make them believe you're an asset before they realize you're a threat. 3 weeks passed like a crucible. Zuri attended her first formal dinner, a gathering of business associates who were criminals in expensive suits, their conversation dancing around territory disputes and money laundering with the delicacy of ballet. She sat at Joon-Seok's right hand, silent but observant, watching how power moved through the room like an invisible current. One of Min-Jun's men was there, a politician with wandering eyes and a smile that made Zuri's skin crawl. He leaned too close, his breath reeking of wine and entitlement. You're new to Mr. Park's organization. Tell me, how does a girl like you end up in a world like this? Zuri met his gaze with the calm Yuna had drilled into her. The same way men like you end up in positions you haven't earned, she said, her voice soft as silk and sharp as a blade. Opportunity and timing. The table went silent. Then Joon-Seok laughed, a rare, genuine sound that carried approval, and the tension shattered into forced chuckles and nervous glances. The politician didn't look at her again. That night, standing before the window that framed the conquered city, Zuri realized something had shifted. She was no longer the girl who had knelt in the rain out of pure instinct. She was becoming something else, something forged in the cathedral of glass, tempered by lessons in survival, wrapped in armor made of silk. She was becoming dangerous. And somewhere in the darkness, she knew Choi Min-Jun was beginning to notice. The story broke on a Wednesday morning, splashed across tabloids and news sites with the calculated precision of an orchestrated attack. The headline was designed to wound, Mafia King's secret, crime boss grooms childhood charity case into personal asset. The photograph accompanying it was worse. Someone had found the security footage from 7 years ago, grainy but unmistakable, showing a 10-year-old Zuri kneeling in the rain over an unconscious Joon-Seok. The caption painted it as the beginning of a grooming operation, a powerful criminal preying on a vulnerable child's compassion for his own twisted purposes. Zuri stood in Joon-Seok's study, watching him read the article on his tablet with an expression carved from stone. Around them, his advisors argued in rapid Korean, their voices rising with each passing second. Min-Jun's fingerprints are all over this, one of them spat. He's trying to destroy your credibility before the summit. The summit, 2 days away. A gathering of the city's most powerful figures, politicians, business leaders, and the hidden architects of the underworld, where Joon-Seok was scheduled to announce a major legitimate business venture. A move that would have cemented his transition from crime lord to respected businessman, blurring the lines Min-Jun had worked so hard to maintain. He's weaponizing her kindness, another advisor said, not bothering to lower his voice. Every news outlet in the city is running variations of the same story. They're calling it exploitation, manipulation. The philanthropic community is already pulling out of the summit. Zuri felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken accusation that she was the liability that would bring down everything Joon-Seok had built. The girl in the yellow raincoat had become a weapon pointed at the king who'd tried to protect her. Leave us, Joon-Seok said quietly, his eyes never leaving the screen. The room emptied like water down a drain. Silence settled between them, heavy with implications. I'll disappear, Zuri said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Go back to my apartment. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. That I was just a charity case. Joon-Seok looked up, and the fury in his eyes wasn't directed at her, but at the world that dared to twist mercy into something ugly. Is that what you think you are? I think I'm the weakness they'll use to cut you down. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hands finding her shoulders with a grip that was grounding rather than controlling. You are not a weakness. You're the proof that I'm not what they claim I am, a monster incapable of honor or humanity. Min-jun wants me to hide you, to confirm his narrative that you're something shameful I've been concealing. Instead, we do the opposite. What do you mean? His smile was dangerous, the kind that preceded declarations of war. We tell them the truth. All of it. How a 10-year-old girl saw a dying man and chose compassion over fear. How I spent 7 years ensuring she was safe, educated, protected. Not because I wanted to exploit her, but because I owed a debt that could never be fully repaid. How she walked into my world with her eyes open and chose to stand beside me anyway. They'll twist it. They'll say, "Let them." Joon-seok's voice was steel wrapped in silk. Min-jun made a critical error. He thought your past was ammunition. He didn't realize it's our greatest weapon. Because the story of how we met. It's the one thing about me that's completely, undeniably true. And truth, Zuri, is the one thing his empire of lies can't survive. Outside, the city churned with scandal and speculation. But inside the cathedral of glass, a king and the girl who'd saved him prepared to burn Min-jun's carefully constructed world to the ground. The ballroom of the Meridian Hotel glittered with a kind of wealth that pretended not to notice itself. Crystal chandeliers casting judicious light on faces that had learned to smile while calculating the cost of everything they touched. The city's elite had gathered despite the scandal, or perhaps because of it, drawn by the promise of watching a king fall from grace. Choi Min-jun stood at the center of the room like a benevolent grandfather, accepting condolences and concerns with practiced humility. "Such a tragedy," Zuri heard him say to a cluster of politicians. "I've known Park Joon-seok since he was a boy. I'd hoped he'd grown beyond such predatory behaviors." Zuri entered on Joon-seok's arm, dressed in emerald silk that caught the light like armor. The room didn't just notice, it stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Every eye tracked their movement across the marble floor toward the stage where Min-jun held court. "Quite the entrance for someone who should be hiding," Min-jun said. His smile never wavering even as calculation flickered behind his eyes. "We're not here to hide," Joon-seok replied, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom. "We're here to correct a narrative." He signaled to the technical crew, and the massive screens flanking the stage flickered to life. Not with the grainy security footage that had been weaponized in the media, but with something else. Financial records, transaction histories, documents stamped with official seals and dates going back 25 years. "Everyone here knows the story of how Zuri and I met," Joon-seok said, his presence commanding the room with the ease of someone who'd been born to lead. "A child showed mercy to a dying man. What you don't know is why that moment mattered. Why it connected two lives that should never have intersected." The screens shifted to show a photograph, a young man in a business suit, his smile bright with hope and naivety. Zuri's breath caught. She recognized those eyes. Her father's eyes. David Bennett, Joon-seok continued, worked as an accountant for what he believed was a legitimate import business. He was honest, diligent, and fatally naive about who was actually signing his paychecks. His gaze locked on Min-jun. When he discovered the money he was laundering belonged to the Choi syndicate, he tried to go to the authorities. He died in a car accident 3 days later. Zuri was 4 years old. The room erupted in whispers. Min-jun's smile finally cracked. "The men who tried to kill me 7 years ago. They were acting on your orders because I'd started investigating David Bennett's death. You couldn't have me digging up evidence that your respectable empire was built on murdering innocent accountants and orphaning children." Joon-seok's voice was a blade wrapped in silk. "The girl who saved my life that night. She was the daughter of the man you murdered. And she had no idea." Zuri felt the truth settle over her like weight and wings simultaneously. Her grandmother had never spoken of her father's death as anything but tragedy. She'd never known it was murder. "These documents," Joon-seok continued, gesturing to the screens now flooding with evidence, "show a pattern. 23 accidents. Over 3 decades. Witnesses, whistleblowers, rivals. All people who threatened your carefully constructed legitimacy. Minjun's face had gone pale, his eyes darting toward exits now blocked by federal agents materializing from the crowd. Zuri stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. You tried to paint my compassion as weakness, my presence as exploitation. But the truth is simpler. She looked at Joon-Seok, then back at the room full of powerful people who were finally seeing the monster behind the philanthropist's mask. Sometimes mercy isn't weakness. Sometimes it's justice waiting for the right moment to strike. The Cathedral of Glass had just declared war. And they were winning. 3 months after Minjun's empire crumbled under the weight of its own corruption, Zuri stood in the same alley where everything had begun. The rain had returned, softer this time, washing the streets clean in a way that felt almost ceremonial. She held the same red umbrella, now 7 years older, its fabric patched and worn but still functional, still willing to shield what mattered. Joon-Seok found her there, as she'd known he would. He'd become predictable in his vigilance, always knowing where she was, always ensuring she was safe. Some debts, she'd learned, were never meant to be fully repaid. They simply transformed into something else. Partnership, trust, the quiet intensity of two people who'd seen each other at their most vulnerable and chosen connection over self-preservation. I've been thinking about that night, she said, not looking at him, watching rain create rivulets down the scarred asphalt. I was 10 years old. I had no idea who you were, what saving you would cost, what it would mean. I just knew that walking away felt like dying inside. And if you had known, Joon-Seok asked quietly, if you'd seen the future, the danger, the complications, everything that compassion would demand, would you have still stopped? Zuri considered the question with the weight it deserved. She thought of her grandmother's grave, the apartment she'd saved, the father she'd never known was murdered. She thought of the Cathedral of Glass she now navigated with confidence, the empire she'd helped reshape, the enemies who'd underestimated what mercy could build when given time to compound. Yes, she said finally. Because the alternative, becoming someone who sees suffering and chooses convenience over humanity, that's not survival. That's just a slower way of dying. Joon-Seok moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. My father taught me that power comes from fear. That strength is measured in how many enemies you can destroy, how much territory you can claim, how thoroughly you can dominate every room you enter. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. And then a child with a red umbrella knelt in the rain and proved him wrong. I didn't prove anything, Zuri protested. I was just. You proved that true strength isn't found in the gun, but in the quiet intensity of character that refuses to compromise even when compromise would be easier. His voice carried 7 years of careful observation, of watching her grow from a girl who saved strangers into a woman who dismantled empires. Empathy isn't weakness, Zuri. It's an investment that pays the highest interest rate in human connection. You invested in a dying man's life when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. That investment returned dividends neither of us could have predicted. The rain continued its patient work, and Zuri thought about all the lessons she'd learned in the Cathedral of Glass. How to read tells, manipulate perception, navigate rooms full of vipers. Valuable skills, certainly. But none of them as powerful as the lesson her grandmother had taught her simply by living. That integrity survives when everything else collapses, that compassion is the only currency that never devalues, that the person you are in the dark when no one is watching defines you far more than any throne you might claim in the light. So what now? She asked. Joon-Seok's hand found hers. His grip warm despite the rain. Now we prove that survivors don't just endure, they build something worth surviving for. Above them, the storm broke into something gentler. And in an alley where mercy had once changed the trajectory of 2 lives, a red umbrella remained unfurled, not against the rain anymore, but as a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of unconditional compassion become the foundation upon which kingdoms are built and legacies are forged.